Everybody, Patrick Connor here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast, boxing history time. If you see Aris on your screen and me on your screen, that's usually what that means. Aris, my pal, of course, CompuBox operator and fellow fight history guy like myself. What's up, man? How you doing?
Everything's good, man. It's been a good weekend of boxing. It's been a great month so far of fights. Great year so far of fights. Can't complain so much. You know what I mean? Only thing I complain about is this bullshit heat.
Yeah, dude, it's like, triple digits where I am and whatnot, but that just fits the super hot boxing discussion we have today. Okay, that was a bad transition, but I had to try to make something of it, right? But yeah, the weather's bullshit. But man, 2023, anybody talking about boxing's dying dead on a slow streak, where are the good fights? Good fights don't happen anymore. You're not paying attention. I mean, if you're not, that's okay. You don't have to be, but you're
I watch a
absolutely full
different
of shit.
sport.
It's been a banner year, dude. So these people are full of shit. If they're saying anything otherwise, it's been really, really good.
And the almost 30 years I've been a hardcore fan of the sport now, this has probably been one of the best years I can possibly remember out of all those years. You know what I mean?
Yep.
There's been some memorable years, but just off the top of my head, this one's been incredible. And we're only just halfway through it. Think about it, man. We still got up until December. And I'm not going to say that I think the list of big fights that we've gotten so far might have just, kind of simmered out by this time, but which is totally fine. Look at what we've already gotten this year. I mean, I'm still hoping for a couple of big ones near the end, but the only big one that we have, if you even want to call it that, is the Fury fight. But I don't consider that anything more than a sideshow, freak show exhibition that I'm sure we'll cover at one point, history wise. But yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there's probably some stuff in the works. There's room for some fights to be made and whatnot, but even so, 2023 has been really good. It started out great. We've had like a number of fight of the year type of fights all over the place, so it's been really good. But that being said, we're here for history, dude. We're here to talk about some old time fighters who've just stuck around forever, forever, forever.
Shout out to the Sandlot.
Yeah, dude. There's of course it's a trope in boxing. Fighters stick around too long. That's just kind of how it is. Fighters almost always stick around far longer than they should. However, we're going to be talking today about a number of fighters who just like stuck around really abnormally long, or especially at a higher level, or there are probably a number of kind of low level fighters who just fought forever but fought only every so often or something like that. But we're talking about the high level fighters who just fought on and on and on. For instance, there are a handful of fighters who belong to the 5 Decade Club. The first one, of course, right on Air's shirt,
Manos DPA.
Roberto Duran.
Yes, sir. One of the all-time greats too. I mean, not in terms of longevity, but at everything accomplishments, his fighting. Duran is a marvel, and one of the few guys that are still alive today that can be considered to be in the top 10 pound for pound of everyone's consensus of all-time great lists. One of the very few guys for that matter. And not only that, is usually in the upper tier of the top 10, not even the lower. Everyone wants to put him usually around number 5 and number 6, whatever. Duran was just that type of special blend of animal. And he's still alive today, still in good health. And when you see him work out and still like go through the motions working with people, you still see that brilliance in him. Still, that mind is still sharp. For instance, remember that video came out where you're sparring with Sergio Mora a few years ago?
Yeah.
And it's like, clearly they're just kind of going through the motions, but Duran is still just like very alert the way he's like moving, feinting, putting his hands up, trying to counter and stuff like that. If basically showing that if he was in his 40s, he would have mopped the floor more rather easily. I mean,
Yeah.
What can be said, Pat? Just he's one of the all-time greats. Like we've discussed him before on the show and everything, and he's been talked about verbatim throughout history, all the right reasons. But Duran is just one of a kind.
No question. From 1968 to 2001. That's how long he fought as a professional.
And that's why
Obviously,
he's the first one we're bringing up here, just because. Think about that. 1968 to 2001. And it wasn't like he took very long breaks in between in his career and stuff like that to make it that long.
from the time when Muhammad Ali was exiled and Joe Frazier was, the kind of de facto champion,
Yes.
all the way until Lennox Lewis's reign. the end of Lennox's Lewis's reign. I mean,
That's
you know,
insane
like
to think about. The way you put it in perspective like that, that is absolutely insane.
that's how long Roberto Duran fought. Of course, at the very end of his career, he was, you know, he's not a very viable fighter. He was obviously very kind of ballooning in fight, ballooning in weight, in and out of shape, not fighting very often, and of course had a couple of embarrassing ones toward the end there, and some of those guys, you know, got a win over Roberto Duran. You know what I'm saying? So it's kind of like kind of shaky
Like
there.
some guys got to win over Julio Cesar Chavez and so on and so forth, as is history. You know,
What was it? Grover Wiley. He was
go for why.
didn't wind up parlaying that into anything, but nonetheless, you know, no,
Willie
it's
Wise did.
yeah, that's true. That's true. You know, but for Duran, the guy was even up though, like even toward the end of his career, where he was clearly kind of past it and clearly just not, uh, you know, not in any way, shape, or form the old guy that everybody remembered from the 1970s that was just an absolute monster, and like I guess the early 1980s too. Well, Jesus, I guess into okay, fine, into the late 1980s if we're being honest. And a couple surprises there, but he obviously had faded by that time, but still could just kind of that by that time kind of his specialty was sitting on the ropes, making guys miss, not really doing much on offense because he was too out of shape and too winded. But you could tell that he was still that guy, kind of a
Yeah,
shadow of that guy.
and he was fascinating to watch. By the time I got into the sport and started really watching it, Duran was already past the point of like the third Sugar Ray Leonard fight, and even past the debacle of what was his comeback in 1991. So when I started watching Duran, first time I really actually found out about him, and this might be the same for you, Pat, is through that game, Boxing Legends of the Ring. Because I had that game for Sega, I want to say, maybe even Super Nintendo. I have no idea. Definitely Sega. I had it for Sega, and I had that game before I ever bought a Ring magazine. So from that game, I knew who Tommy Hearns was. Well, besides my dad telling me about these guys, Tommy Hearns, Leonard, Duran, Robinson, Graziano, Lamata, because it was all midweights, and James Toney, because of course Tony was the young, super. What was he? Probably at the near the top of the pound for pound list at that point too. So you had to put someone current in there. Tony fit the bill. Anyways, that's where I first learned about Duran, and my dad telling me stories. He was like, "Man, that Duran was a nasty guy. I heard him say in the ring one time he was going to kill somebody if he didn't, if he trained a little bit harder." And I was like, "Whoa, really?" Because that sounds like some shit you hear in wrestling. You know what I mean? And
It was like, yeah, it was actually kind of worse than that, actually.
very much so, because they didn't actually say they want to kill somebody. Listen, WWF in the early '90s, they weren't talking like that. So, that piqued my interest, obviously. And then fast forward to when I become a hardcore fan and start really, learning about Duran, I'm just like, holy shit, this guy was absolutely brilliant. And the world took notice of that also too. You said he started his career in the late '60s when Ali was still in exile, and by the time he finally made his first appearance in the Madison Square Garden, against a guy by the name of Benny Huertas, um, Duran was still relatively unknown. Huertas at that point, he wasn't a guy that had a spectacular record or anything like that. A more journeyman fighter that gave everybody a good fight though. I mean, he was a solid boxer puncher that knew his way around the ring, and he actually fought a few times in New Bedford, surprisingly enough, out in Sargent Field. My dad probably saw him over there because my dad said he used to watch the fights over there. Anyways, Huertas was one of those guys that knew his way around the ring. It wasn't a person that normally got blown out. And it was on the undercard, I believe you can correct me if I'm wrong, Pat, on the undercard of Buchanan Laguna, Ismail Laguna. I don't know if it was the first or second fight, but that was Duran's first appearance, and he splattered Huertas like he was a shooting victim. You know what I mean? He just came over there and ran right over him. Huertas just laid out there, splayed out, completely flattened, and everyone in MSG was just kind of aghast and going like, "What the fuck did we just witness here?" Like that was like a tornado that just hit. And soon enough, you find out he was probably going to be the greatest lightweight the world had ever seen.
Yeah, it's pretty it's pretty amazing too, because there is video of it, and I'm not sure if it was immediately after this fight or immediately before it that he started working with Ray Arcel,
I think it
But
was after this fight.
yeah, I think you might be right. I think it was like then before the Buchanan fight. But regardless, he was a somewhat known quantity, at least because he had gone and he'd worked out at Gleason's.
Mhm.
He'd been around New York a little bit and he'd been in the US. So a number of trainers and a number of people like, look, this is this is how shit used to work. It doesn't
Yeah,
work quite that way now. It probably does, at least to some degree, but it used to work this way far more often, where if there was a fighter that nobody really knew about, or nobody had heard of because he started fighting in some country or some other place or whatever, they'd bring him into a big city and say, hey, I got this kid, you got to see this kid. This is exactly how it happened. I mean, it happened with Marciano. This is
yeah,
how it happened with, I mean, just two easy examples because I researched this shit, but Bonavena too. Oscar Bonavena, they brought them both to around New York, had them train in either Gleason's or some other gym in New York, and we're just like, hey, you know, come look at this. Hey, you manager, you promoter, you trainer, come look at the. We got this young kid, and so that's exactly what they did
Rodrigo
with.
Valdez, I guess, would be another because he ended up with Gil Clancy.
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah,
and there were a number of these guys, like Ray Arcel was among them. Uh, the whole story with Charlie Goldman was that Charlie Goldman took on Marciano because everybody else was like, nah,
yeah,
look at this guy, dude. He's just like, "Ugh, ugh,"
yeah.
just look at this fucking guy. Nobody wants, no, we're not training him. And Charlie Goldman was like, ooh, look at him. He's punching hard. And so anyway, same scenario here, except for Duran looked really good in the gym and people were like, holy shit, hot damn, this guy can move. And that's exactly how he got kind of pushed into the limelight fairly quickly in the early 1970s, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So like Ray Arcel, we've discussed him plenty of times on the show, old time trainer that went back to the early 1920s and just an absolute legend in the game. He trained everybody from like, Barney Ross to Ezra Charles to the comeback of Benny Leonard to he had so many champions up until, when he had to retire because he was kind of forced out by the mob and different things. And when he tried running his own shows in Boston in the television one day, people that didn't like that he was doing that walked up with a lead pipe, conked him on the head, and sent him into retirement for a couple of decades. So he gets a job at I think it was a metal company, like doing selling or something like that. And he was doing well, pretty successful doing that and traveling. But he always kept his ear to the game and was still actively watching and keeping an eye on boxing. But getting
Every
back,
so often telling Barry Tompkins that he didn't know nothing about Tommy Gibbons.
yes, still one of my all-time favorite clips. Well, you must not know who Tom Gibbons is.
It's like,
Which
man, what do
definitely
you know
did.
about Tommy
Yeah.
Gibbons?
He was like, it was one of the best guys we had back then. A killer jab, and that was a really good fight. Like, the fuck, are you serious? And then
Fuck what
Tompkins
you heard.
no, and then Tompkins at the end of it has to go, yeah, well, unranked Tom Gibbons against Jack Dempsey. Dude.
Like, yeah, jabbing.
Yeah. So, anyways, back to the Arcel thing. Finally, where we get to like the mid 70s, and he gets like a little bit of an itch, enough at least that he'll be if someone offers him a bone, he'll be inquiring about it a little bit, right? And that's what happened in Panama. What I see you about to say.
That's always like one more champ. That's always what all the great trainers say.
Yeah,
One more
yeah,
champ, one more champ.
exactly. So I want to say it was Carlos Zeleta, right? That brought him over.
Yeah.
Yeah, Carlos Zeleta brought him over because his fighter Alfonso Peppermint Frazier was going to fight against the legendary Nicolino Loche for the WBA Junior Welterweight Championship. He felt that even though Frazier might be an underdog, the fact that Loche was coming to Panama to fight for to defend his title, he thought that Frazier might have a good chance, and Arcel going over there, might give him a slight little edge. So Arcel said, like you said, he felt a little bit of an itch. He was like, all right, I'll take it up, especially because it's just a one and done for him, he was thinking. So he goes to Panama. He snuck into Loche's camp, sniffed around over there. He said he looked like a fool, that he dressed up, in a whole, like a Panama hat, sunglasses, flowery shirt, like the whole ordeal. And someone actually called him out on it. He was like, I know you. You're from Stillman's in New York. And he was like,
Mhm.
yeah. And he was like, what you doing out here? He was like, I'm on vacation. He was like, vacation in Panama? And he was like, so you working for Frazier? And he was like, and he goes, nah. And he was like, how do you, he was like, why do you ask? He was like, no one's asked me. So, anyways, he ends up, he studies him enough, figures it out, comes up with a game plan, and Frazier scores a big upset. After this, Arcel decides, okay, I'm feeling good. I'll just work with him, maybe if anything, but I'm not trying to get involved too much. But that's when it later brought in Durant.
Different animal entirely,
Absolutely.
obviously. But the lightweight version of Duran was a slightly different fighter than the heavier version. Obviously, moved different, far more active in there offensively. Just an absolute machine, and somebody. I mean, he just wrecked a number of different very good fighters in the lightweight division. Uh, not exactly not a surprise given his reputation, but as he carried that weight up, still stayed pretty good.
Yeah. Oh, incredibly. I mean, well, think about his title win. You know what I mean? Like, Ken Buchanan was one of the best, most skilled lightweights you'd find in a long time. Like, an incredibly skilled fighter. Beautiful boxer, had an incredible jab, just very, very tough, just a very, very good all around good fighter. And just one of those guys that, would be a long time champion if you ran into an animal like Durant. And that fight, as much as people like to talk about how vicious it was and vicious for Buchanan for that matter because of the ending of it, Buchanan put up a beautiful fight, man. It was a pretty brutal fight back and forth, but Buchanan was just getting overwhelmed by the ferocity of Durant. Like, it was just constant, constant, constant. And then finally, around round 13 or so, when Durant finally just lets one go right there to the balls, just hits him, and you see Buchanan's face in absolute agony. And referee Johnny Lobianco is just looking around there, and he hadn't really, he didn't see anything.
Yeah, he
just,
was in a bad position for it.
yeah, 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 deer in the headlights. You know what I mean? Just didn't notice it, and you see Buchanan drop, and you see Durant just hover over him, and Buchanan just grab himself, his mouth agape, and tears probably streaming down his face. Like, that was the definitive of like Durant as a lightweight. That's how he left most guys. He didn't hit them all down below to do that, but I mean, like, that's the position most of his challengers and non-title challengers for that matter, because he was so active, ended up just laying there in absolute agony while Durant coldly stared at him. Fuck, man.
Yeah, dude, brutal shit. And yeah, poor Buchanan said for like decades that every time he'd see a photo of Roberto Duran, his nuts hurt. I mean, the guy, he got nailed, but
Bad. It was
the
bad.
Brit fans and the Scottish fans are still pretty salty about it. I mean, I get it.
Tend to hold grudges, bro. I get it, but I mean,
I
that was.
get it, but he was beating him up pretty good at that point. Now, Roberto Duran, absolute genius in there, man.
It really was. So you go through his lightweight reign, and then he said he moves up to welterweight, and that's his first phase of his career. He beats Leonard in maybe one of the best wins in boxing history, let alone just of the 80s. And then he has the no mas. He has to regroup from that. That takes a little bit of time too because he has some hiccups along the way. You know what I mean? He
That
gets
was actually sadly the first time I'd ever heard of Roberto Duran. Not I wasn't, born yet, but I mean that like my dad and my brother were both massive just general sports fans.
of
And
course.
so every so often my dad would say like no mas, or some shit like that. And I didn't know what it meant. And one time I asked him what it meant, like why he would say that, and he told me. And so that's the first time I'd ever heard, sadly. I hope, thankfully I fucking got beyond that
Mhm.
with knowing what Roberto Duran's about. But yeah, that was a massive hit to his reputation, unfortunately.
It really was because it was just so sudden. It was so anti what Duran was all about. You know what I mean? One of the most macho, badass fighters in history at the up to that point, it seemed. And one of those guys that you would think he would just go on a shield to rather die in the ring as opposed to quit. And initially, I ran Ray Arcel out of boxing. Like, he was so disgusted by the ordeal that he quit it originally. Because he said in all the years that he was involved in boxing, he had never witnessed one of his fighters just do something like that. And he came back afterwards, actually in Duran's corner. And a lot of people don't recognize this, but if you look closely, when Duran fought Wilfred Benitez, Ray Arcel is in his corner. I don't know how active he was in there, but you see him a couple of times there, whether Duran rolled on, that he was, assisting him. And he just does not look like he's happy to be there at all. I'm pretty sure that was his last corner he ever worked. But anyways, yeah, it took a lot of rebuilding because Duran, like I said, he loses to Wilfred Benitez, who was a brilliant fighter himself, and no shame there. But you can tell the fire was gone. And then when he loses to Kirkland Lang, that's when everybody writes him off, and you're like, okay, that's it.
Yep.
All-time great lightweight. Could have been a great welterweight, but he puttered it out, and then he just started out the rest of his career. But then comes that second phase again, because Duran came in phases. You know what I mean? And now that second phase comes up, and he first makes that initial comeback, and then when he beats Davey Moore on his birthday for the junior middleweight crown at MSG in one of the most brutal fights you will ever see, like right there at that point, man, like Duran now is, you see the greatness even more so. Not just him being an all-time great lightweight, but you're just like, wow, this might be like a great, great fighter, because who can come back from shit like that? The way people put him down, the way the boxing community turned his back on him, everybody. And then, of all people, Bob Arum actually picked up the pieces, and that's why, because Teddy Brenner, the all-time great matchmaker, told Arum, hey, something, old fighters can be reclamated. They just need someone to believe in them. And that's what Brenner did. Like, Arum said, okay, pick him up. Brenner started matching him up. He beats Pepino Cuevas, starts getting more confidence. And then by the time he destroys Moore, he fights Hagler, brings him to the limit, on and on and on. And then after he gets splattered by Hearns, you think, okay, that's it again, right? Like, how's he going to come back from something like this? And then it's the late 80s, and he beats Iran Barkley. Like, what kind of guy is this? You know what I mean? So it's like, it's incredible to think. And then I'll pass it back to you right after this, but like, there's still another phase to his career after this, because after he beats Barkley and won the all-time great performances in an all-time great middleweight fight for that matter, he loses a ho-hum decision to Sugar Ray Leonard in their third and final fight. And then to start off the 1990s, he loses to all people, Irish Pat Lawler, in another fight where he quits, this time saying his shoulder was messed up or yada, yada, yada. So you would think at that point now, he's been fighting now, like you said, in the late 60s, all the way now we're in 1991. He probably should have been retired at some point maybe after the Barkley win or after the Sugar Ray Leonard fight. And now it's 1991. He's quitting in a fight against a guy like Pat Lawler. He should be done, but he's still not.
Somehow they found enough barely ranked middleweights and like kind of small super middleweights and shit like that for Duran to feast on, for him to fluff up his record and kind of get himself into position for a bigger fight or something like that in the mid 90s. So I mean, it's always possible. If anybody's got a name, if a fighter's got a name, they'll do it. If it's Tuesday night fights, if it's some other, I mean, there weren't really that many other programs around that time in the 90s that would have, I mean, there were a couple, but not a ton that would have done that, especially after losing to Pat Lawler, losing to Ray Leonard. And it's not like those were like wars or anything like that where he was, putting in the work. Basically, it's, somebody banking off his name is an old Roberto Duran. That's it.
Like, Duran was supposed to win that Pat Lawler fight. That was on the undercard of some pay-per-view. I think the Tyson one or something. But it wasn't like he was supposed to lose that fight. That was supposed to be his comeback win. The only reason why Pat Lawler got that fight was because he beat the remnants of whatever left of the corpse of Wilfred Benitez. And so, like you said, if you like win one of those fights against a name, they'll give you another name, or you bounce around. So that's how Pat Lawler got the Duran fight. He just got lucky enough that Duran threw out his shoulder, whatever happened. But to bank off what you said, like a show like Tuesday Night Fights was one of those breeding grounds back then. You know what I mean? Where it was the safe haven for like the comeback and fighter. George Foreman had a number of fights on USA Tuesday Night Fights. Larry Holmes used to have a fight seemingly every other month when he would knock out some poor schleb and then announce his retirement. And Duran made that a home for himself too. Like he was beating guys up like Heath Todd and other guys from, the middling Midwest that we joke about and like, DM each other about sometimes. And he was keeping himself healthy. And in between when he was beating up these guys, once in a while he'd be able to step up to a higher profile fight on pay-per-view with the likes of Vinny Pazienza or Hector Camacho.
Yep. Mr. 5X himself, Vinny Pazienza. Duran Pazienza, dude, the fight so nice they did it twice.
Same with Camacho. Yes.
Why? I don't know, because it was not,
Because
not
Durant
really.
arguably won the first fight of both of those fights. But I think the most interesting and memorable stat of Durant and his very like Don Quixote, like mid 90s, run through various divisions is that he had I think it was a pair of fights with Jorge Castro, who was another long career fighter, and not that long from freshly removed from being middleweight champion, IBF middleweight champion it was. And Duran split a pair of fights with him, which is pretty impressive considering his age and the wear and tear he had on himself at that point.
Yeah, and Castro actually was another fighter, yeah, like you said, who fought for quite a while and then had kind of like almost like a second career and whatnot, and probably would have still been fighting, perhaps not now, but would have kept fighting longer had he not gotten a really bad injury that took him out. Yeah, but in any case, yeah, I mean, to even still be competitive, it's not like, with all due respect to Mr. Pazienza, and of course, middleweight Hector Camacho, with all due respect to these fellows, it's not like we're talking about, super high level, but even so, as many years as this was, almost 30 years into a pro career for Roberto Duran, man, that's pretty fucking wild that he was even able to stay competitive and able to defeat the likes of a guy like Jorge Castro, who
In
himself was.
1997 at that point, 97.
I
You know,
do I do actually remember the Camacho fight. Like, I remember we wound up getting that fight at, like, I want to say my stepsister's house or something like that. But I remember watching that shit. But beyond that, that was obviously not a good. That's not a good version of Manos de Piedra to fucking be
nah,
watching. And
absolutely. And then his last fight was against Camacho, right in that rematch. And I remember I didn't watch it because I really didn't have interest, but I know I might have switched. It was switching around. I think there was like a preview of Duran getting warmed up in the dressing room, and he was just wearing a pair of speedos with his gut just hanging out over them while he was shadow boxing. And he just, like when you like those old jobber wrestlers that just like the old timers from like the 80s that still kind of hung around that just had like the beer guts hanging over themselves and just got that's what
oh
Duran
hell
looked
yeah,
like. I'm like, dog, the last thing I need to see is Duran in a pair of speedos just like shadow boxing around in his dress room, shuffling around. Like,
yeah, dude. It is
2001, he was still fighting. Like, my God.
toward that portion of his career, he was basically just having difficulty keeping his weight down, and wound up fighting all the way up at light heavyweight.
Yeah.
Come on now.
And he even got in one more title fight too, because we all talked about how Don King can always try to squeeze the blood out of a stone as much as he can. And he did that with Duran when he put him in again with William Joppy in an absolute gimme title defense around 97, I think it was. Probably after the Castro fights.
It's not exactly his fault, but William Joppy definitely presided over a kind of crappy version of the middleweight. Especially the WBA contender wing was not good in the mid and late 90s, dude. And William Joppy just presided over that shit. And unfortunately, he was one of the guys I was talking about notching a win over Roberto Duran, where it's like, don't try to talk about that. Don't try to shout that out like that's like, among your highlights, bro. Come on, that's
That was
bad.
like Showtime's version of like airing like an Ali Holmes type fight. Like it wasn't as brutal because it ended abruptly at round three. Duran obviously didn't take that much punishment, but it was sad to see because you could clearly see in that fight, even though Duran was old as dirt at that point, that the mind was still there. You know what I mean? But his reflexes weren't, and you would see him move and do certain things that you're like, okay, like he clearly if he was only just like 10, 15 years younger, he definitely would have taken advantage of whooped on Joppy for whatever he was doing. But like, he just couldn't do it. You know what I mean? But like, he was almost still dismissive of what Joppy was doing. He just couldn't do anything with his body, just couldn't keep up with it. You know what I mean? But you could still see in his face that like, he really thought Joppy wasn't shit, which he wasn't compared to actual real Duran. No disrespect to Joppy, who was a good fighter in the late 90s, in the mid to late 90s. And like you said, a doldrum era, but one that he was near the top of for a number of years. So
Yeah, he excuse me, existed in the exact same middleweight division as Bernard Hopkins for however many years and just never really seemed to have any interest in unifying with Bernard Hopkins. Then, although to be fair, there probably wasn't a lot of money in that either. So, I mean, just what it is, it wasn't really a whole lot of money in unifying that title until Felix Trinidad entered the equation.
Exactly.
But regardless, point being that Roberto Duran was still, within the realm of, this era actually, for that to have happened when it did. Only a couple years later was Hopkins Trinidad. I mean,
Yeah.
that's pretty wild, dude. So that's how long Duran's stuck around though, which is just fucking amazing.
And to be honest, his career probably would have lasted a little bit longer if he didn't get into a serious car accident. That kind of just forced him to retirement. But
It's like a back injury or something like that, or I
I
don't
don't
remember what
remember.
it was, but
I know it was something pretty serious that he was forced to retire and he couldn't do anything about it, considering his age. But
well, his weight like got way up for a while,
it
and
did. But he looks great now.
yeah, he looks great now.
And all right, last question about him before I guess we move on. Do you consider him the greatest living fighter today?
Probably,
Yeah.
yeah, probably. Especially if I would say that he probably does rank in the top 10 fighters of all time. If not, then he's just outside of it. Whatever. I'm not
I
really
would
that
put him in
much.
the top 10. In fact, I would put him in the higher, like around 7 or so. I
Yeah,
mean,
I'm
I
I'm
don't,
not going to
I'm
nitpick
not big
any of
on
it, but
lists. I'm just kind of thinking to myself right now, but like I would definitely put him at least rungs above like number 10. He's in my top 10 for sure.
yeah, I wouldn't argue that at all. And so yeah, if you agree with that, then yeah, he's almost
If you're
certainly the
talking
greatest
about
living
like
fighter.
greatest living fighters today, it's for me Duran, Leonard, then probably Larry Holmes.
Right. And then right outside that, probably Broner.
Yeah, I mean you can't AB baby, you know.
I mean, he's going for Division 4.
He already is a 4 division champ, man. What you thinking?
Oh no, I can't. That's right. I can't even keep track any.
Oh, bro, don't disrespect the champ. Don't disrespect AB like that 4 times, baby.
Yeah, we're counting IBO and
Listen, once he gets to that 5 time champ, first ballot Hall of Famer. We already know.
Anna Stoda. I'll vote him in. Nah, probably won't. It'd have to be a down year. It'd have to be a pretty down year.
Even on that note, there's a bunch of guys on the ballot that I probably would. I'm not even probably. I would absolutely vote ahead of Broner. But I love you, AB.
Probably. So we'll do another fairly well-known fighter here that's pretty easy to talk about, doesn't require a whole lot of reaching as far as going into the hardcore bin or going to the fucking woodshed for the crazy facts and whatnot. But like I said, well-known fighter Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion, also a fighter who fought for a very long time, kept longevity for especially for the time, especially for the style of fighting that he was often up against and the kind of transitional periods he went through during his pro career. But his style is what really helped keep him in the game for as long as he was, even though toward the end, sounds like there was some kind of dispute as to whether or not the fights he fought were either fixed or exhibitions. Who knows? Still fought for a very long time. I mean, starting in the 1890s, right? Like right around the turn of the century. Very interesting time for boxing. We've talked about it a number of different times, but I mean, there's a lot going on, not just socially, but in boxing and how boxing is developing, the public perception of boxing, whether or not it's allowed in certain states, cops coming after you, you got to go out to fucking sail out to a boat in the harbor to go fight, etc. There's more than one example of these kinds of things. So, yeah, it's a very interesting period for boxing. And Jack Johnson started in 1897.
And then ended his career around 1931. I mean, again, there's like gaps in between stuff like that, but that's just like that's a pretty incredible stat right there. You know what I mean? That's one of those things that the longevity, when you look at it, is astounding. And again, it's a tribute to his style, like you said, because he was one of the first guys that even though he started in the late 1800s. We talked about this earlier today. Um, the transition and the changes and the evolution of boxing happened so kind of rapidly at that point. You know what I mean? Like there was a lot of changes happening, and guys where from the days of the last of the bare knuckle fighters, like the John L. Sullivan, holdovers of that time period, who was still being active at the turn of the century, and others, you started seeing the tweaks in technique and the way fighters were ever using things now with defense and doing this and doing that and movement and ring generalship and things happening. And you were seeing guys now at the turn of the century that were just like unlike anything you had ever seen. Peter Jackson, for instance, from Australia, one of the first great black fighters, was one of the guys that was like known for having a different technique and looking, especially during the Sullivan era, as a guy that stood out from the rest. And for someone, if Sullivan never drew the color line, good chance Sullivan would have got thumped by him, but it never happened. Then gentleman Jim Corbett came around, and he's usually known as like one of the fathers, I guess, of like modern boxing and how things that are making a turn for where they happen today. We talked about this earlier, but like George Dixon, who at that point in time when Sullivan was still active and after Sullivan retired was probably known as the greatest fighter in history at that point. That should have been the first like modern guy showing what was going on. That guy was George Dixon was doing things that no one had seen in boxing after that point. Like he was the Floyd Mayweather of his time. You want to put it in perspective.
Yeah. What Jim Corbett, we've talked about this before, and we're both kind of annoyed and aggravated by him. He's kind of just got that face. He's got that hairstyle and that fucking face, to be honest. And also, I mean,
He's just one
really,
of those really just douchey, and then like you can
and
tell he was pompous and arrogant, even though he had that nickname. And then when you read books and find out how much of an actual blatant racist he was, it just makes you hate him even more.
he's more the godfather of fighting with his fucking ass cheeks hanging out. What the fuck, Corbett? What were you? I mean, dude, I don't really care. Like, wear what you want. Not trying to shame you. I'm
I'm
just trying
just
to
saying,
say
man. I know those things were
there were
sunburned because
shorts.
he was
We know
hot.
there were fucking shorts that existed back then. You don't need to fight with your fucking ass hanging out, bro. But he did.
Like you mean to tell me in the Corbett fight that his cheeks definitely get burnt? Absolutely, they must have. Like
Well, Fitzsimmons put him right on his fucking cheeks. That's for sure.
that he did. That he did. Um, but you think about like the evolution of what they went through, and then Johnson was like a whole different being too, from especially from the different heavyweight champions. Even up that point from Corbett, he was like just a different being, and he his way it was his control of the ring. You can almost argue that you haven't seen a more relaxed heavyweight from Johnson up until like second generation George Foreman. And I know that's a long ass gap to say, but I guess Ali goes in that category too, because think of how relaxed he was in his second career and the way he just leaned back and took care of things and all that. But like, it's the relaxation that Johnson had in that ring and the way he used to fight was just like none other. Just the way he came in, his smile, his confidence of everything, how he just knew what he was going to do. It wasn't the most exciting style, but it was just such a dominated way that no one could do anything with him because he just had such command. He just knew what you were about to do. He was 3 paces ahead of you all the time. He knew how to use a jab. He knew how to clinch when necessary. He could body you around because he was physically strong. Kind of, and more so, like surprisingly, like in a way that Terrence Crawford is. Crawford can body guys on the inside and bully them around, and kind of people are surprised they can do that. Johnson was able to do that with anyone else too. The way he would clinch you up and just push you back and then go bop, 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 and then take you in. What can you do with a guy like that? Most of the generation of the heavyweights that came in were very crude. They didn't know how to handle a guy like Johnson's stature and Johnson's skill set. And that went for a lot of dudes. I mean, there was some heavyweights that weren't white that could handle a guy like Johnson and go, tit for tat with him. Dudes like Joe Jeanette and Sam Langford and Sam McVeigh, and the list goes on of, guys that Johnson used to fight and then decided to avoid once, he can get more lucrative paydays against the easier white fighters. And those dudes just couldn't do anything with him. Like, look with him against like fireman Jim Flynn. How he just kind of bodied him around, did what he want, pop, 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 other stuff, what he did with Tommy Burns, most famously with Jim Jeffries in the fight that caused riots all over the country because of him just toying with him like a cat with a mouse. Johnson was at that point something that the world had never seen,
Yeah.
and he was incredible.
Yeah, no question. He had the kind of style where, yeah, it probably wouldn't translate very well today, but he was obviously an intelligent guy and an intelligent fighter who I don't really have much doubt that he would have figured something out in today's age and whatnot. But
Sure.
I'm but I mean, at that time though, yeah, nobody had seen a fighter where he was called the Galveston Giant. He wasn't really that giant. He was only about 6 foot, 6'1", which is not that big. But in that time, that was a solid built fighter, of course. But he
Mhm.
was big enough to handle himself and big enough to, like you said, handle himself in the clinch. A lot of what was happening though in the ring with the evolution of what was going on in boxing and the public perception too. Back in the day, like before this, even back in the 1800s, a lot of what was written about boxing and the public perception about boxing, because you could see it in newspapers, people would write into newspapers just like they do now. People would write in newspapers, "Oh, this shit's so barbaric. I fucking hate it. What are you guys covering boxing for? This is some bullshit. Fighters are dying. Fighters are, look at their faces when they're done." It's the exact same type of shit people say now. It's not, there's the criticism was the same, but a lot of the difference was obviously because of bare knuckle. Some of the facial injuries, the hand injuries were far more severe or severe looking. And so as shit got pretty nasty and fights could get bloody and cuts could get gnarly really, really quick. And so on top of that, the crowds liked slugging. They wanted slugging, and that was the expectation. A fighter could get penalized in a fight if they were considered like avoiding the fight. And that was a big change around the time where you bring up George Dixon. And I mean, yeah, Corbett to a lesser extent, but Fitzsimmons too. Fighters who were counterpunchers or fighters who were not just, wade in
Not to
and
bring up Fitzsimmons, yeah, man, that's another guy we both love for sure.
yeah, and not, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with slugging, but that was what John L. Sullivan was known for. He was known to be a good slugger, like a skilled slugger, not just somebody who came in and didn't look, but he knew how to get himself into position and to, et cetera. But a lot of that changed around this time. And so Jack Johnson wound up being a fighter where avoiding punishment and avoiding like kind of just shutting an opponent down, shutting them down offensively so they couldn't do shit. That's not pretty. It sucks. It's not entertaining, but it's effective. And a lot of fighters had no clue what to do against that style. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't do anything inside. He was too fast and too clever for them on the outside. And so that was what really bewildered a lot of people, was that it
And
was a different style.
honestly, it's still a style that's still effective today. You know what I mean? There's still variations of, if you watch some Lennox Lewis fights, you can't tell me that Lennox Lewis doesn't have something like how the way he shut down Holyfield or other guys that would come too close and just boom, boom, take him out right there, take him out, pop, pop. Like, it's not pretty. Sometimes it's not exciting, but it works. Other like John Ruiz,
Yep.
I hate to say it, but a guy that would just clinch all the
Do
time
the
and
kind of like chest to chest moving around, refs over
yeah,
here, bap, bap, bap,
yeah,
like ref moves over to the other side, bap, bap, that type of shit. Like,
Hopkins would do it. Like, but Johnson was just one of the early pioneers of perfecting it. And he was damn good at doing it because no one was able to stifle that during his reign.
and talking the entire time.
Amazing.
And which was
Hopkins
just
was really awesome.
infuriating to
Yeah.
every white person within earshot. They couldn't stand it. Got so mad.
Especially Gentleman Jim.
And fireman Jim Flynn, who also could be in this discussion, but two separate times. Like, I mean, I have the newspaper reports if anybody's that interested in it. Two separate times, Jack Johnson fought fireman Jim Flynn, and in two separate fights, he's basically just putting a kind of steady whooping on him, talking to him, et cetera, et cetera. And so fireman Jim Flynn gets so mad two separate times that he starts calling him racial epithets right there in the middle of the ring, yelling at him, talking to the ref. And both times, Jack Johnson was like, "Oh, really?" and just knocked him out immediately. Both times, two times. How amazing is that?
Oh yeah, and then the clip in the rematch, because if you read the newspaper accounts, they say that Flynn turned into a billy goat and just tried to headbutt Johnson over and over. And if you watch the film, I think of the second fight, you see Flynn literally do that, just charge at him. And Johnson is like a matador, just bop, 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 just hitting with 1,000 jabs before he's like clinching him up. And Flynn, like you said, probably hurling a bunch of disgusting words at him. And then, yeah, that was the time. That was the norm of the era, though. Like you had that during the Jeffries fight. Everybody hated Johnson, and Jim Corbett is there ringside, just spewing at the mouth. Getting, first he's like cheering on Jeff at ringside. Looks like he wants to mix it up a little bit, Jeff. And then Jack Johnson will be like this, pop, pop, hits him with a combination, clinches him up, and then smiles at Corbett. Corbett, obviously, probably wearing layers of wool and everything because of the time period and what was in style, sweating, seething, sitting there clutching his cane, just and then exactly right, just
panicking.
Yeah, and then looks like he wants to mix it up a little bit, Jeff. Oh, like this, pop, 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 pop. Clenches him again. Starts patting himself even more with the towel and stuff like that. And then, by the time it looks like Jeffries is getting pummeled, his face is looking like, a bruised plum, and he's just getting his ass whooped, right? And you'll hear something like Corbett say, and these are all like random quotes, I'm telling you, that were like from different accounts. Can't you do something, Jeff? And then you hear Johnson or something like this. I hits him with an uppercut, bop, it's another 4-piece, clenches him and smiles again with his golden tooth smile. And at that point, Corbett almost has an aneurysm. Like think of it the way in more modern times, if you want to watch wrestling, right? And you say Vince McMahon sent in one of his goons to beat up Stone Cold or something, and Austin just starts beating the shit out of the guy. Keeps on looking at McMahon and mocking him while he's doing it. And how you see McMahon ringside seething, and you see the vein throbbing in his head while he would just going crazy. That's probably how Corbett looked ringside while Johnson was whooping on Jim Jeffries. So
yeah, not at all hiding that he was upset. So it's like
at all, not at all trying to hide it at all. He was just seething, absolutely seething, frothing at the mouth about it.
Well, and then in his training camp and in his corner, he had just like the master class of white dudes who refused to fight black fighters. John L. Sullivan, I don't think he was in his corner, but John L. Sullivan visited him in his training camp and was all, putting his support behind him and shit. James Corbett, Joe Koyensky at least fought some black fighters, so you got to give it to him for that. But regardless, Joe Koyensky was there.
Kowinski has I don't mean to cut you off, but Kowinski has that famous story with Johnson, right? Where they fought each other. Knocked him out because, he's much more experienced. This was a young Johnson that he fought. And they got put in jail because it was an interracial fight, and that was supposed to happen. And there's that photo of them locked up together, right? Which was probably posed. Definitely.
I'm sure to some degree it was posed.
But what was what's allegedly happened too is that Kowinski was giving him advice, right? That he talked to Johnson and gave him
supposedly. Well, and yeah, I mean, if you're following the popular accounts, not only did Koyensky give him advice, but he gave him crucial advice that changed his,
that's
wank, fucking wank. You know what I'm saying? So there's always got to be the white dude who sails in and saves the fucking day at some point. But Ken Burns, fucking guy. But regardless, no, I mean,
the guy who narrates those shows is pretty fantastic, though. That voice is good.
It's well done, dude. It's really well done. It's just that it's leaving out a lot of shit, and it's kind of pushing heavy on some shit that's not.
I mean, that's every Ken Burns documentary, though, too. You can say the same thing for his documentary on X. There's a lot of pockets that were missing there that a lot of people brought up gripes about. Great visual.
It's a great story, and it's a really captivating version to tell. But
I'm sure you can say the same about his Civil War one, which I've never seen. But if I looked,
that one was really good. I thought that one was really, really good. That was part of what made his fucking. But regardless,
definitely got to look that up now. But okay.
No, it's good. But in any case, that the Unforgivable Blackness leaves out a lot. In any case, we've talked about this too. It kind of looking at Jack Johnson as a slightly more complex character than he's often viewed, I think is a lot more fun anyway. But regardless, going on into his later career, he had when he lost the heavyweight championship to Jess Willard, he obviously his career had kind of fallen apart by then. He, even before then, his career was starting to fall apart when he had already gone into exile to Europe. He was struggling to even find fights as the heavyweight champion. He was trying to figure out, like, who am I even gonna fucking defend the heavyweight title against, which is pretty wild when you think about it. You can't find a heavyweight challenger, what? But it was a lot of it was Europe was on the brink of war right at the time. That was at least part of it. The British Boxing Board of Control at that time had just instituted their color bar when Jack Johnson became champion, because they were basically, for whatever reason, not wanting any of their fighters to get entangled in any of that. And so Jack Johnson's options were fairly slim after that point. And he had been inactive, just bleeding money, needed money really badly. And then on top of that, wasn't really training the way he should have been, lost his heavyweight championship to Jess Willard. And after that, just kind of became, the fighter who was constantly trying to chase a comeback. That was really all it was. He talked about potentially fighting Dempsey at one point, but there was no way that was going to wind up being, the case ever. So he wasn't really a viable fighter for the vast majority of his post Willard career, but he still fought on.
He really did. Now, as I go through his box rec, and it's interesting too, Pat, because post Willard, like you just said, is not his career post Willard is not something that gets brought up very often. Doesn't get talked about a lot. Unless you go into his like books and biographies or whatever, they'll skim on some of it. But yeah, like you said, Johnson was always one of those guys that was very boastful and always would be in the papers making challenges and grandstands and doing things for that matter, but was just kind of still, grasping at straws. And it's because he was exiled from the USA, exactly, like you basically said, especially as champion, he was already exiled. As you see, he's defending against Frank Moran, he has to defend him in France, he has to do this, like, because of that bullshit Mann Act that they employed on him. Where at the end of the day, this was put on him just because he was a man of success as a black man in America, heavyweight champion of the world, and was very boisterous about it. And so not only did
they went after everything he did.
Absolutely everything he did.
He opened up his nightclub in Chicago, and they fined him every other day.
Yep. So he's still, because of his because he's kind of in struggle to make some kind of like living consistently after his career's over, because he's exiled from everything. Like, he's still like persona non grata. He has to keep his career going. Sure, he could take little side gigs doing, making appearances here and there and doing whatever, but that's not going to pay, for the life that he wants to live. So he has to keep on continuing to fight, even if it's against guys that are just, nondescript opposition, a person debuted here in Mexico, a debuting here in another place, a debut fighter in, Madrid, Spain, and end up fighting somebody like a Bearcat Wright who wouldn't be able to hold a candle to him in his prime, but, he gets stopped against a guy like that because he's already washed. You know what I mean? He's still just hanging on. And it's kind of incredible because he's really up there in age, but we've talked about this too. He ends up being, active up until the point where, like, 2 years before Joe Louis turned professional, which is wild to think in retrospect, because he still ended up needling in Joe Louis's career while Joe was, still young. And we've talked about that before on the show, which is, it's like sad and hysterical at the same time, because Johnson did it for twofold. One, he clung on to Louis because he knew that Louis was a popular guy and he wanted to keep his name in the spotlight. And two, he didn't like Jack Blackburn. Jack Blackburn fucking hated him, as a lot of black fighters from that era did, because they felt Johnson's antics held them back because they weren't as boisterous as Johnson was. And Johnson, being the way he was, and kind of spoiled it for the rest of them, because who wants to give a chance for anybody now when Johnson is acting the way they do, and they're like, oh my God, they scare them.
Yeah.
And Blackburn was from that era that was like, Jack Johnson being an idiot kind of fucked me over. So
I mean, obviously there's a different portion of him being the first black heavyweight champion, that the other portion is that he didn't, fight any black fighters except for battling Jim Johnson, and who was not. and supposedly a lot of people don't know this because that since it happened in Paris, a lot of the buildup and shit like that was from French newspapers. But I've done, let me adjust my classes that aren't. I've done the research. Fucking actually, what Jack Johnson had said at the time was that battling Jim Johnson's, according to Jack Johnson, had been going around and calling himself quote unquote champion Johnson
Yeah.
and advertising himself battling Jim Johnson. And so Jack Johnson was mad about it and said, that's why I want to fight him, because he's been going around pretending to be me. And when in
Why
reality, it
does it
was,
sound like something Tyson Fury would do today?
yeah, I mean, it's crazy, but that was the excuse he used. And even
Like
then,
that
people were
literally
like,
sounds like something Fury would use that excuse to fight somebody.
well, and even then, people were like, I guess. Okay, then. So, I mean, but yeah, not good. So that's the other part of that, obviously. But the way that Jack Johnson's career carries on, first of all, you mentioned Bearcat Wright, who was the father of the first black wrestling heavyweight champion ever, Bearcat Wright Jr., which in and of itself is a stat little piece of trivia some people might not know. But the whole Joe Louis thing, dude, there's a backstory supposedly that's far more personal from Jack Blackburn, according to Jack Blackburn. Jack Blackburn, who was far, way smaller than Jack Johnson, he himself was a former welterweight,
Lightweight, well,
lightweight. Okay, something like
he was
that.
the lightweight that ended up fighting Harry Greb after he got out of jail for a ball.
That sounds about right. Okay, I knew he was smaller, but I
He
wasn't
fluctuated.
positive. In any case, he was definitely smaller than Jack Johnson. And according to Jack Blackburn, he had sparred with Jack Johnson at one point very early in Jack Johnson's career and was like not beating him up or anything, but like hanging with him. And Jack Johnson was mad because he was like, there's a little guy hanging with him. And so supposedly, according to him, it was right on the verge of when Jack Johnson had started getting paid and that Jack Johnson had a place that he was staying and that he would let Jack Blackburn stay and kicked him out like in the middle of the night or some shit like that. And so Jack Blackburn was super fucking sore about it and pissed about it. And then he like held a grudge against him. And so I don't even know if that's true, but if that is true, then that adds an even extra layer of beyond, however he felt as a black man and as a, black against a black champion, et cetera, et cetera. It's shit ain't for me, obviously, but
That would
nonetheless,
definitely make sense. I would be
I,
pissed about that too. Holy shit.
yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's true, but I remember Jack Blackburn telling that story in a Sports Illustrated article from like the fuck, way back in the day. But
But that's incredible. Yeah, I mean, but one thing you can't say about like as much as eccentric Johnson was and loudmouth and yada yada yada, he did have a mind for boxing. He was a genius of the sport, all right? Because even though he was needling in on Joe Lewis's career, we've talked about this before on a previous episode, but the guy, I mean, we just talked about his career. He knew what he was seeing in the ring. He was very smart. And then for that matter, I'm pretty sure the pre-title Joe Louis Jack Johnson could have taken because he predicted, like we talked about one time, as much shit as Johnson was talking, he knew that Joe Louis wasn't a finished product. And when Joe Louis was going to fight Max Schmeling, he predicted Schmeling was going to beat him. And we talked about it before because Johnson noticed, being very in tune, watching a lot of stuff on Louis. Louis always dropped his hand a little bit whenever he would throw a jab to bring it back. I mean, like, it was quick, it was still subtle, but like he still noticed enough that if you were quick enough and you were willing to eat a few of them because you have to, get your sense of timing before you're able to do this, then you would be able to counter it with a good right hand, which Schmeling had. Schmeling had probably the best right hand in the heavyweight division at that point. And we all know Schmeling brutalized the shit out of Lewis in that fight because he said he saw something, which is what Jack Johnson saw. And Johnson then made one of the biggest bonehead decisions in history, not just boxing history, but almost history in general, because it almost cost him his life, is that he went to Harlem, Joe Louis country, the middle of Harlem, after the fight ended, with all of his winnings, thinking that like somehow he'd be okay, and waving them around before he got jumped by all the neighborhood.
yeah, got surrounded, and they basically said it was like a second from coming to bloodshed, and then somebody was like, hold on, hold on. and stopped it, but he almost lost his life that evening, according
He
to
literally went
witnesses.
around waving around tickets, saying, talking all kinds of shit about saying, "I told you Joe Louis was going to lose." The Schmeling, and this is like obviously predating World War II, like the crazy Nazi thing going on, but still, the fact that Joe Louis was a hero, he gets knocked out. Everyone's really sad and somber that night, and here comes Jack Johnson, gold
Yeah,
tooth,
the fuck are you doing?
dancing around, probably with his beret on too, because he was wearing that a lot in in his post career. Just
With a cane,
Oh
fucking fur
yeah, yeah.
coat.
I mean, Johnson was a very stylish dude, man. That dude always had a nice little drip on him, right? All those post photo, like the leather gloves he was
Yeah,
wearing.
even when he was poor, even when he was like owing shitloads of money, he was still trying to put up appearances. That's just the
I
kind of
mean,
guy
he
he
was
was.
good from head to toe. He was always looking smooth. You can't deny him that. And apparently, anytime when he was doing like vaudeville acts or doing something where, because it's been written in various magazines, like some people would be like, "Yo, you didn't even do anything." Like he would show up and just kind of leave. They said that one time a guy approached him, like this person that wrote this article. He was like, I approached Johnson, and I was like, "What the fuck, man? You didn't do anything, old man. What the hell?" And Johnson kind of like pushed his chair back and said, "Go ahead and try to swing at me." And I was like, "Okay." And he took like 5 or 6 swings, and Johnson was old, and Johnson barely even moved, just kind of like slightly tilted his head each way and did something. And the dude was sitting there exhausted. And Johnson just kind of gave him like a fist, like, "I can finish you," and just kind of shuffled away. And the guy just stood there in amazement and just walked away like home and just walked home in bewilderment.
I mean, the way that the dude went out is the way that unfortunately a number of other famous fighters have gone out. But at least there's a bit of a I don't even know how much of the tale of right before he died is true, but the popular kind of mythology is that he was driving with his companion. He had a driving companion. He had gone through several wives, and he had like a friend who traveled with him. Basically, the story was that by this time he was old. He probably had the early stages of dementia, I would imagine, because from what
I mean,
people
it's like
said.
1946, right? So yeah, I can
Yeah.
see.
And he had, according to some people, he had just kind of been losing a little bit, and that the his driving companion said that he had been driving worse and worse lately. And the problem was that Jack Johnson loved to like speed. The dude was just a lead foot, like put his fucking foot to the fucking metal, and apparently, according to the companion, they had stopped at some sort of cafe that refused to serve Jack Johnson, despite the fact that he was, of course, the former heavyweight champion, because he was black. And so then they took off. And according to the companion, Jack Johnson was pissed about it and speeding and just negotiated a turn poorly and ran into, I think it was a telephone pole, or hit a telephone pole. And the impact was bad enough that Jack Johnson's internal injuries killed him, but the companion survived. So
Let me ask you this, Pat. What about this the story told down over the years that saying that Johnson was on his way to the Joe Louis Billy Connery match when he died in a car accident?
I don't know if I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the dates and shit.
Like I see a
It
lot of
could have been.
and a lot of articles, like people saying Johnson died in a car accident. They're like, where was he en route to the Joe Louis Billy Connery match?
Oh,
And
might be true.
yeah, I mean, maybe I don't know. I just don't want. I just was curious if you knew like any more to that. But
I'd have to look, but I don't remember.
there is that famous quote that Johnson did, before he passed away. I'm assuming a few years before, so where he got pulled over for a ticket, right? And what was the price of it? I don't know what it was. Like I'm gonna say
I don't know. The guy, he
$5.
said something was like $25. So
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
here's
25 bucks.
50.
Yeah, and he said, "Here's 50," and he was like, "Why'd you give this to me?" He was like, "Cause I have to come back this way."
Yeah. Who knows if it actually happened, but it's a good story.
That's a great line. Absolutely. So Jack Johnson, man, that was a good pull.
Roberto Duran, Jack Johnson. Who else we got for these foos who stuck around too long or just a long ass time?
First off, this might have to be a two-part episode because there's a lot of guys we could bring up for this stuff. But another guy I wanted to bring up was a former Duran opponent and another person that lasted as long as Duran did throughout the decades, Saul Mambe,
Good
sweet
call.
Saul. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely a fighter who like especially for how long he stuck around. There's like 3 fucking photos of the guy. What the fuck, dude? There's like no photos of him. It's crazy how, I mean, there are a handful, but it's just funny because, you would think that for how long he stuck around, granted, not at the highest of levels, for he was at a fairly high level for a short period of time, and outside of that, not very high level. But even so, for how long he stuck around, you just think that people would know a little more about him, have more photos, have more video, etc. But there's not nearly as much as you might think.
No, when it comes to video, it's very, very like few and in between. There was even when he was champion, because Mambi became champion in the late '70s, and then he finally
A few of his fights, I think you're, yeah, just kind of considered gems and shit, like highly sought after.
absolutely. I'm gonna get to that in 1 second. It's like Mambi was just one of those guys that he didn't his style didn't translate into being popular, and he wasn't a popular fighter, and he was just like known as one of those guys that since there was no pull behind him, why even like document what was going on? He was just kind of in the threads of things. But he was a brilliant boxer, um, who came up in New York City, and his parents, as a black fighter, came and was converted. His parents converted to Judaism when he was young. So he said that he was bullied a lot as a kid, walking through his neighborhood in the Bronx and such, as he was wearing a yarmulke and stuff like that. And other kids would want, pull it off and beat him up and do things like that. And so he was forced to learn how to box. He was forced to learn how to defend himself, which, he did to great effect. And when he turned pro in 1969, that was, his first fight in September of that point, right away, he was kind of thrown into the wolves relatively quickly. By 1971, he's fighting the likes of Edwin Viruet, and like a lot of the fucking really, really tough guys of the New York City club scene that he has to go through. And before you know it, 1976, he's fighting the likes, and he's still a relatively newcomer, just kind of building his way through, fighting these guys, and he has to fight the likes of Howard Weston Jr. Howard Weston Jr. is one of those guys that junior welterweight and welterweight contender, and one of those guys that if you look at his record back then too, a person that didn't have the best record, like he always 15-6, 18-6, 20-8, whatever. Like I'm just throwing numbers out there, but this is like the type of record he had. If you look at who he fought, he was a rugged individual, slick as shit, who fought a who's who. Vito Interfermo his first loss and beat the shit out of Rocky Mattacholi. Fought a draw with Howard Weston. Gave Wilfred Benitez 2 extremely tough fights. Was actually beating Tommy Hearns before he detached his retina before Hearns became champion. Like one of those just really rugged individual New York fighters. You know what I mean? That was put through the grinder like Salamambi was. And then he's fighting Roberto Duran, lightweight champion in a non-title fight, and in fucking Miami Beach. And God, man, of course, really quick, when I was working on Hank Kaplan's archives, a decade ago or so, one box that he had was like 40 posters of mint Roberto Duran Saul Mambe on site posters. And I wish I just could have had one of those, because like he had like 50 of them. What do they? I don't know what they did with them, but they don't need 50 of those posters. You could have given me one. You know what I mean? Yeah. So,
Damn.
anyways, like, yeah. Oh
Give
yeah.
him out as fucking stocking stuffers and shit.
I
Damn.
mean, dude, like and if you look at the old Miami Beach posters, you know which ones I'm talking about, right? Like they had like the kind of like bright backgrounds with the 2
Mm-hmm.
buddies on it. It says Chris Dundee, Angelo Dundee, but it's like the neon and like the pink kind of blending into it a little bit. You know what I'm saying, right?
Damn, that sounds cool as fuck too.
No, it's not cool. And then this just has a photo of Duran. It had a photo of Mambe on it. And it was talking, no TV, no this, no that, blah, 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 blah. I just remember that box specifically because like Hank Kaplan just kept just fucking everything, man. I've never seen a collection like that. And I wish I appreciated it more when I was actually working on it, when I was a punk kid, as I am as an adult today, and knew what I was getting myself into. But that's neither here nor there. But I mean, think about it. He's fighting Duran in '76. That same year, he's going in with Antonio Cervantes. Like Cervantes, who doesn't get brought up enough today at all whatsoever, is recognized as, maybe one of the great. That has to be one of the top 5 greatest junior welterweights in history. Like that guy was just a bona fide legend. It's just the fact that, excuse me, he made appearances in the States a few times here and there in the 70s, but the majority of his career was spent overseas, whether it was in native Colombia and other parts of the world where he was just beating the shit out of everybody else. But I mean, that guy was an all time great. But these are the type of guys that Mambe had to go through before he finally got a title shot in 1977 against Saint Sack Mansour, who we've had one of our buddies on Twitter, Thomas Delorme T-Bone, asked us to do a Thai episode one day, and I'm sure he'll be a guy that we bring up. But for a guy like Mambi, who had a ho-hum record up and down, just kind of struggling, trying to figure things out, this is his first shot. And this is one of the videos, actually, that you talked about being a grail, because Lee Groves and other collectors have always talked about over the years as being one of the holy grails of fights they wanted to see, because it's been talked about. It's been filmed. There's various bits and clips on YouTube, but only like a minute long. But to break it down, this is the first fight that Mambe had to deal with, where he started dealing with his prohibitive, the bad luck he would start receiving over the years. That's the word I'm looking at.
Sansak Mongsurin is one of those fighters who's former Muay Thai fighter, which is fairly typical of a lot of fighters from Thailand. I mean, probably even now too, but especially around the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, all the way to Samart Payakarun, who's one of the greatest Muay Thai fighters of all time, considered by many the greatest Muay Thai fighter of all time. But that being said, Mongsurin had a really like typical, style of many of those fighters, where they're very aggressive, often kind of squared up, but like, swung. They swung, you know what I mean, and made fights fun. So
Mongsurin was a beast, bro. He's fun to watch. Like the few clips that you find on YouTube, which is of him not getting obliterated by, like, say, Thomas Hearns.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can tell he was a beast. You know what I mean? Absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of those dudes were just sturdy as hell, physically, just if not super ripped or big or bulky, just muscular and tough, and the type of fighters that you didn't necessarily want to go in against, because it was going to be a rough night. I've obviously never seen that fight, because if I had, I'd fucking tell everybody. I'm not that kind of person hoarding it to myself. But regardless, yeah, that I do know that from
Essentially the
interacting
clip
with
of it, though,
Lee.
right? Remember, I think essentially like the brief clip that they had of it.
Yeah, but I've never seen the whole thing or seen it
Ever.
around or anything like that. But I know from interacting with Lee and from knowing kind of like the type of fights that collectors like that look for, I know that it's among the kind of grail type of fights.
It is, absolutely. But that was the fight that kind of put him on notice, I guess, in the world. Because Mongsurin, even though he had a lot of Thai fighters throughout the years, had a very novice record when it came to the pro ranks, they still were recognized as being a genuine badass dude who was, plowing through the competition.
Yeah, they waste like no time. They're not trying to build the record or anything. They're just going right in.
Yeah, straight up. They just, 5, 6 pro fights. Okay, put me in a little world type of fight. And they usually win too, especially in the lower divisions. But yeah. But Mambe put on a masterclass performance by all accounts, especially by the ringside accounts. I'm assuming Joy Koizumi was there, others, and they all said that Mambe probably won going away. By the brief clip that you see online that I finally sent you, and a lot of people were very excited to see, you can see that Max Stern, like you said, was very aggressive, going through it, trying to swing for the hills, but Mambe was composed, countering, and generally getting the better of it. And Max Stern won a very controversial decision, but understandable considering where the fight was held. So a guy like Mambi, even though he loses that decision, it's controversial. He probably would obviously benefit more today in the type of era where social media was around, so he can get like more clamoring for an immediate rematch or whatever. He had to struggle a little bit. You know what I mean? He wasn't going to get a title shot that quickly. So a couple of years passed. He has to, plow through and do what he has to do. And after beating guys like Norman Storm and Norman Goins or Marlon Thomas, he finally gets another title shot against Max Soren's successor, Sang Hyun Kim, and then again, he has to travel all the way to Korea for that fight. And by this point now, Mambi had signed with Don King, who Don is just monopolizing. You know what I mean? Don just kind of picks up everything, even if he feels like you're not going to be a champion or whatever. He feels you're going to be useful enough for a few fights that he can like put you in with somebody to make some money off of. He'll do it. And Mamby, I feel like he kind of did it as a commodity for that. So Mamby gets shipped off to South Korea, and an extremely close fight, which again, we talked about his footage being non-existent. Only the last round of this fight exists. And the last round is when Mamby scores, second to last round, excuse me, where he scores a beautiful knockout of Kim to become champion. Unlikely at that point, And Mamby at that point now he's champion. He's one of those guys that like, okay, he's a very experienced fighter. He looks good. He can box well and everything, but like, he's just kind of on the back burner. He's not that popular enough that you're going to really put him on television and really try to like, put him in a marquee fight, even though you feel like he deserves it. And so he fights Esteban de Jesus. Esteban de Jesus is Roberto Duran's first, gave Roberto Duran his first defeat, former lightweight champion, a guy that, had a memorable name throughout the 70s, but by 1980 is completely washed, mostly for outside the ring issues. Mamby beats him. Then he ends up fighting Termite Watkins on the undercard of Ali, on the very, very beginning of the undercard of Ali Holmes, and gets shipped off to various countries now. You know what I mean? Like, gets to fight Thomas Americo in Indonesia, gets sucked off to Nigeria to fight, I can't even pronounce his name, Obsis. Damn. A few of our friends are going to kill me for not even knowing how to say this, but you can do it better than I can.
I'll take a stab. Obesis and Wangpa.
Yes, there you go. Perfect. Before he gets jobbed in a very close fight against Leroy Haley.
Yeah.
And no one really cared at that point when he lost to Haley. You know what I mean? Because at that point, I would consider that Mamby was on par with somebody like, how would you say it? You know how Don King would pick and choose his heavyweight champions, especially at the WBA, and just place them, whatever. I don't really care. He promoted Haley. He was promoting Mamby. If he loses, so what? You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. He didn't necessarily feel like Mambe was like a star that he needed to hold on to. If he lost, whatever. If he didn't, okay, fine. He'll stuff him deep on undercards like he kept doing. But like if you look at Mambe's career, he's coming up, especially before he's getting big shots and before he's getting a title shot, he's fighting at the Felt Forum a lot. Of course, Aris, who holds the record for appearances at the Felt Forum, Buddy McGirt. But I think that Mambe is like not too far behind him. And so Mambe he was making a lot of appearances, but then he wins the title, and all of a sudden he's just fighting wherever, dude. He's just going around Detroit, Nigeria, wherever. And I think that says a lot, unfortunately, about his popularity, that there really wasn't much, or otherwise they would have been finding him venues to really, be a star or really be headlined, showcased, etc. That was not the case. And so that on his part was also bad luck too. Not an exciting style, not an exciting fighter, not an exciting personality, a very interesting backstory, but just not one that was ever really told. So it was unfortunate. That was kind of what he wound up going through. And after he loses that title, he wound up rematching Haley. And I mean, again, just bad luck with these fights, really close fights that he's losing decisions in.
Yeah, he loses an extremely close fight in a rematch to Haley. And then from there, like, he just becomes, one of those guys that throughout the years, his contendership went down each year a little bit. But like, he would always give a really good account of himself, but he quickly, after he lost the belt and then lost,
he'd give you rounds. He'd definitely give you rounds.
Well, I mean, he has one of the greatest chins in boxing history. I think he was only stopped one time, and he was very rarely ever really dropped or anything. Like, he just knew how to box. He knew how to survive. He was a genius in the ring. Larry Holmes was one of his best friends, and Larry employed him as his main trainer, I believe it was, if not his co-trainer, when he challenged Oliver McCall for his last heavyweight title fight. So, that's how much Mamby, is held in regard and that type of thing. Like, Mamby was one of those guys, again, like, he wasn't exciting. We talked about it with Jack Johnson. It doesn't have to be exciting. He knew how to survive. He knew how to box. He just knew what he was doing in the ring. And guys like that, especially when they don't have the best records, but they just know how to give you rounds, and you're going to learn something from them, even if they're completely washed. A more recent example would be like DeMarcus Chop Chop Corley, right? A former champion that has had a long-ass career, has a record similar to Mandy's. And I mean, he's been stopped many more times than Mandy has, but like a guy that just, you were gonna get rounds with him, experience, and just move around and figure things out with. And Mandy was that guy. Like, think about it. Soon after that, Ronnie Shields, has been known as one of the top trainers for decades now. But if you didn't realize, it was a top contender in the junior welterweight division in the early to mid '80s. Loses, a decision to him. Billy Costello gets another title shot to him. Buddy McGirt, who you just mentioned, and it's a who's who. Like, he's still able to pull upsets here and there. For instance, Glenwood Brown, who was 18-0 and a rising star on the New York scene and blasting everyone through when he fought Manby in 1988. Manby put on one of his best performances of his career. Apparently.
Like probably his last, real good performance. Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, that was one of those fights that was super coveted for a number of years. Lee Groves told me that was one of his top 5, top 10 muskets that he couldn't find anything of. And I finally was able to secure it for him. I made a deal with a guy on Twitter whose name shall not be mentioned. And he got a copy for Lee. But it was cool. Like, Lee was able to see that fight. And Lee was confirmed that it was as, amazing as people made it out to be about Manby's performance. So I was cool that he was able to see it. But yeah, Manby just became one of those really serviceable guys that throughout the years, he'd lose more than he'd win. But he always still just kind of went the distance and fought a lot of who's who. You know what I mean? Like, when a guy needed some wins on his record or wanted to have a big win, he fought him. A guy like Maurice Blocker, who went on to become welterweight champion. And he would still, again, even in the early 90s, still be able to pull out a win. For instance, remember Larry Barnes, the guy that fought Felix Trinidad for the welterweight crown in the mid 90s. And if you know him and if you've seen a few of his fights, he was probably most known for wearing literally a hockey goal mask on his face, as like a to bring the swelling down as opposed to using the end swell. Anyways, that was Manby's last big upset win, and then he just became a serviceable journeyman from there. But he kept on fighting. And you're like, yo, this guy's fighting from 1969. He's never retired. Here he is in the 90s, even in the mid to late 90s, and he's still fighting. He suffered a gunshot wound one time when defending his son in an altercation. He went through all kinds of stuff. Like, Manby was still going. And the most memorable thing, I think, one of his more memorable moments was around, what was it, when he made that other comeback. He had one more fight in 2008. And this was the early days of Twitter, the early days of, other social media, right? And YouTube, all that stuff. And you see him there and he's training and he's talking and blah, blah, blah. He's hitting the heavy bag and all that. And whatever, the reporter that's doing the report on, the reporter that's doing the story on him, she goes, oh, not only does Manby think he can make a comeback, he thinks he can fight Ricky Hatton. Yeah, I'm never sure Manby even knew who Ricky Hatton was at that point, right? But Manby goes out there and he says, and he was like, listen, man, of all those titles out there, which was 1 million of them, he was like, all those titles out in that division, one of them belongs to me. And he was 63.
Dude served in Vietnam.
Yes.
Before his career began. And then his last fight was while George W. Bush was president.
God bless Mandy, man. That's one guy I regret never meeting. I always wished I could have met him because I had so many questions for him.
Yeah, dude looked like
so fascinating.
He looked like the killer from that movie Ghost.
Yeah, he did. Well, I really found him to be a fascinating individual, man. I just wish I could have met him.
No, for sure. And definitely unsung too, compared to what he should be. Not the greatest career on the face of the planet. We're not saying he's top 10 pound for pound, but a guy that gets forgotten, especially considering how long he fought. Even his the normal portion of his career, he lasted a long time.
Give him his flowers, man. Definitely.
He was another guy who's in the 5-decade club, dude. 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s.
Yeah, totally.
Fucking wild shit. So here's another fighter who, he fought so many times. We're not going over his career. We can't go over 250 something fights, dude. It's going to take too long. But Kid Azteca, Luis Paramo.
Yeah.
definitely one of the other fighters in the 5 decade club here, if we're naming it that. It's if we're it's kind of strict rules. I guess we're just talking about fighters who fought in 5 separate decades. There are other fighters who technically fought longer. It was just that how they timed out that their when their debut timed out or whatever is when it why it
That's why I
wound up.
said this is like has the potential to be a two-parter for sure because we got a lot of other guys to cover that they may have been spaced a little bit more, but they definitely deserve to be mentioned. But
Yep, no question. And Kid Azteca is one of those fighters who's looked up to as a lot of people might not even realize this, but it wasn't until the early 1930s that a Mexican fighter came up and became world champion, because it seemed like it would be much much earlier or something like that, but there were definitely Mexican fighters who were popular and fighters of Mexican heritage who had become superstars and stuff like that, but none who had become world champion. But Kid Azteca was one of the fighters from around that time and especially in the 30s and 40s who'd kind of risen to prominence and gotten really popular, even as a fighter who was just a contender. So he was a guy who also came from a really famous neighborhood in Mexico City called Tepito, where if you look at the kind of, if somebody, I've never done it, but if you had made a list of Mexican world champions and some of the greatest Mexican fighters, for whatever reason, they come from this particular neighborhood in Mexico City, which is pretty interesting. A number of fighters have. So Kid Azteca fought from 1929 to 1961. Jesus Christ, dude,
yeah,
that's
that's absurd.
crazy.
Some people don't even live that long. And I hate to say something like that, but that's just like that's an incredible career.
That's nuts, dude.
Like you know what you like the amount of time that covers, the amount of history that covers, the shit that he's seen from like all right, he started his career before Joe Louis. He started his career before Joe Louis, even started his career, right? And then like Dempsey was just almost finished from a year or two before that. And then he finishes it while right, Ali was starting to be active. Like think about the
That's
time
that's a
period.
lot of shit that happened in between then. That's a lot of shit and a lot of like technological advancement, a lot of changes in boxing and
I
where it
mean,
was
there's so
going.
many generations you're seeing going through. Sugar Ray Robinson's career is winding down by the time he finally finishes his career.
Well, and this is also something that you and I have talked about too. Like I said, we're not going to be going over all of his career here because it's too much. It would take too long. But excuse me, there he also belongs, if you look on BoxRec, on the there's an entire category, fighters with more than 200 fights. It's not as big a list as you would think when you're talking about like upper level fighters. There's a lot of fighters, but not as many upper level fighters as you would think. But one of the things that fighters who have fought that many times, you talk about Harry Greb and even Ray Robinson, as many times as he fought and stuff like that. Ray Robinson, as big a superstar as he was, a lot of these fighters were not fighting that many times just because they felt like it. They weren't fighting 250 times because they just wanted to fight 250 times. The vast majority of them weren't. There were some fucking sickos out there, don't get me wrong. But I mean, these guys were fighting because they were getting paid like, $50, $100, $150 for fighting shit like that. They're fighting that often because they had to, because they were trying to make ends meet and needed money. 1929 was when the stock market crashed, and that's when he turned professional, which meant that he would have had to fucking fight. Shit would have been live. And in Mexico around this time, there's also a lot of shit going on. So yeah, dude, wild to have his career going through as much as it did.
Oh nah, man. It's his career just like spans to think that he was still active in the early 60s and this was the guy that was knocking out Fritzy Zivic in the 40s is kind of just like mind blowing to me when you go over his career. Like you said, like you can't you can't downgrade something like that. You know what I mean? The fact that he was still active and like he lived to be close to 90 years old. And there is photos of him I've seen as a kid in various like ring magazines and stuff like that because he was an active guy even in his age. Like I think because he was inducted in the World Boxing Hall of Fame, right?
I think so, yeah.
He did make appearances. He was like kind of active making appearances around like various, fights, fight cards and functions and stuff like that. And there's photos of him signing autographs. And it's
And
like,
he
oh
looked great too.
yes, that's what I'm saying. Like he looked great. And that's wild for a guy that had such a long career like that. And other fighters didn't even have a career quite, not even twice as long, even close to as long as something like that. And, they had various issues retiring and going through this and that. Like some people, man, they're just built different. Him and Jake LaMotta, they come from like a different cloth, where shit just didn't affect them.
Got wins over Seferino Garcia, fought, young Peter
Yes.
Jackson, defeated young Peter Jackson, Coco Kid. It's not like Rodolfo Baby Casanova.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was gonna say Coco Kid as well. Absolutely.
There, and I mean, he kind of, I'm not going to say, like I said, he didn't have the greatest, of greatest opponent level and whatnot. And there, if you look through his career, there's a lot of bums, dude. And I mentioned this the other day when we were talking about fighters who had the most knockouts and shit like that. Every single one of those fighters knocked out a lot of bums. The thing was, knocking out a lot of bums also was not easy. So yeah, even so, 250 fights, dude, going through 250 fights and then coming out on the other side, being okay. Bless the guy.
Oh, nah, man. It's an incredible pull in. He's just one of those guys that doesn't get talked about enough today because he's completely forgotten, especially when you bring up like, the best Mexican fighters in history and things like that. Like he doesn't need to be near the top. Obviously, I understand that. There's a lot of guys, with credentials of like Olivares and Salvador Sanchez, Chavez, the list goes on and on. But if you don't mention a guy like Kid Azteca and you mention like, how long that the career they had, which overblows everybody's, then you're clearly not doing your homework on that. Like he's, give him his flowers as well. Like this is one of those guys. That's an incredible career for as long as it lasted, like, spanning as many generations and decades and presidents and heavyweight champions and this and that. And the way the evolution of boxing was going too. Sure, like from 1920 1961, it wasn't that much of a gap. Like guys, from those eras and what the 60s were going through, it was, a little bit, but at the same point, like, the basics of what was going on was still kind of there. But think about this. He came from one of those eras that he was still active in when he was still active in the late 50s up until 1961. He could have been one of those dudes from the Crum Dungeon era, as we all are. No, my era would have kicked your ass and stuff like that. Seferino Garcia would have smashed, Emil Griffith, or even though Griffith wasn't champion, 61. I'm just giving examples of things like that. You know what I mean? Or so and so would have beat the shit out of that. Fritzy Zevic would have, poked the eyes out of who was the welterweight champion of the 50s, of the late 50s? Don Jordan.
Yeah, I guess it would have been around, yeah, Don Jordan or so.
I mean, Fritzy Zevic definitely would have beat the shit out of Don Jordan, so whatever. But I mean, think about
Yeah,
that. Like,
dude.
let's just and then 192 wins, 47 losses, 11 draws, and probably a bunch of other undocumented fights that I'm sure he would attest to. I mean, nah,
It's just pretty wild.
yeah, definitely. He was one of the first. He was one of the guys I was thinking about too to bring up, and another person that's just like if you don't know a lot about him, just look him up because it's a fascinating story.
Let's see. Do we want to do one more before we?
Yeah, absolutely. And the last one I was going to bring up was another dude on my sheet. And like I said, we have to do another one because there's a lot of guys
I
that.
think we are. Yeah, I think we are gonna have to do a part two.
Archie Moore.
That's a good call, dude. That's a very good call, especially with how long it took for him just to get a title shot.
Absolutely. And the fact that most guys would have been long retired for years at that matter by the time he finally got his title shot, and then for how long he lasted and reigned, and then even after his career ended and what he did for a guy like George Foreman, and kind of passing on that magic juice of this is where you're going to make yourself longevity. Archie Moore has to be mentioned.
For a long time too, it was widely believed, considered, Archie Moore was the all-time knockout king. But the invention of the fucking internet, shit changes, bro. You know what I'm saying? Motherfuckers start researching, looking up shit, learning things. What the fuck? And now I'm sorry to tell people that some dude named Billy Bird, that, you know, not very many, especially Americans, really know about, holds the all time knockout record. Get mad about it. I don't know what you want me to do. All I could say is that Archie Moore probably has some fights that weren't documented too. So if you want to like notch a couple onto him, go ahead. I don't care. That being said, still, dude, more than 130 knockouts. That's pretty
I mean,
fucking amazing. You know, you're knocking 130 people out. That's pretty fucking
for,
wild, you
for
know?
the, I mean, for the fact that most fighters today don't even like approach close to 60 fights for that matter before their career ends. The fact that Moore scored 130 knockouts on his own is pretty fucking wild.
Yeah, dude. And it, you know, obviously, like I was just saying, there's some bums on there, dude. There's a lot of bums on there. There's no
Course,
lie.
as you know, part of the course for anyone from that era or different eras. You know what I mean? And when you see a record that's padded with 160 something wins or this many or whatever, stuff like that, there's gonna be a lot of guys that you're just gonna look at their record and say, "What the fuck?" And everybody on
Yeah.
Twitter likes to jump up, "Oh, 100 bums, 100 cab drivers." Like they used to say, like they said about Chavez when I posted that clip of him where it said 75-0. Yeah, 60 cab drivers. No, no, no. There's no 60 cab drivers on his record. All right. Sure. Is it padded with a lot of schlebs early on? Of course. Fine. That was just how it was when he was coming up. A guy like Piano Man Jones, does that sound like a world beater? Because that's who Moore knocked down in his first world in his first pro fight. But no, Moore came through one of the toughest eras you can imagine. They had to go tooth and nail with Black Murderers Row. Do you think that was easy?
It,
That would ruin most careers, and none of those guys ever became champion except for Moore out of that bunch. So
and you know, it's fucking wild too, because a lot of the time during those arguments someone would be like, well, look at Ray Robinson. It's like, no, don't look at the fucking worst possible example you can bring up with one of the most accomplished fighters of all time as holding that up as if that's the low bar. Stop, just fucking stop it. You know, it's ridiculous. Of course Ray Robinson fought like a who's who, and probably the biggest list of who's who in terms of wins and losses. We get it, but nonetheless, dude, Archie Moore fought a lot of fucking well-known fighters. He's got some losses on there too, of course, but that's what happens when, you know, he started out as a middleweight. He's only about 5'10", 5'11". He wasn't a big, even at middleweight, wasn't a very big middleweight. And on top of that, part of the he had a condition where he wound up having to have surgery later on, and people speculated that his condition where he wound up having to have part of his intestine removed wound up adversely affecting him and that making him gain weight, etc. Doesn't even matter. Point being, like you said, early on in his career, he was considered part of that kind of Black Murderers Row group of fighters who were basically shut out, and not they were not really going to be getting title shots, especially at middleweight. You know, during the 1940s, and Archie Moore had to fight his way through this group, you know, and sometimes lost.
oh yeah, and had to fight some badass white dudes too. For instance, you know, in his first major step up, he fights Teddy Yaros, who was middleweight champion of the 30s and a beautiful boxer himself, a guy that doesn't get talked about more than enough today. Yaros was a bad, bad man. And Yaros, you know, understandably outboxed Moore pretty comprehensively in that fight. Moore said he learned a lot in it. And Yaros, which is really hysterical to think in retrospect, said after the fight, said something to the effect of, you know, Archie's a good young lad. He'll learn a lot, something like that. Like he'll go far, which is funny because Moore, you know, considering how long his career went and old Archie and everything like that, the fact that a guy like Yaros beat him around and was like, yeah, yeah, he's a young kid. He'll get it is kind of funny. But that's where
Yeah,
you
them
start.
Yaroses, dude, they were pretty popular for a minute there, though.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. And then like not only was he fighting, like we said, Black Murderers Row, he had to fight other really tough guys like the Hogue twins, Shorty Hogue and Big Boy Hogue. Um, badass fighters in their own right who did not draw the color line and fought everybody and anyone around that time. Both of them really skilled, and I think Moore lost to both of them, you know. And then from there, he's fighting guys like Jack Chase, who was from the Murderers Row, Jimmy Bivens, um, and you know Holman Williams, Coco Kid, Lloyd Marshall, losing to Charlie Burley, and he's like trading wins and losses with these guys as well as fighting other dudes like Oakland Billy Smith, who wasn't really a part of that group, kind of on the outside because he wasn't, as skillful as the rest of them, but still a badass in his own right. Who, what did he knock out Harold Johnson at one time?
I
Both of
think
them
so.
really,
Yeah.
yeah. But it's a really tough, dangerous guy in his own right. Mora has to fight these guys multiple times. All right. This is where his career is heading. So where all these guys' career is heading. They're too dangerous to really be put against anybody of the absolute elite until they get too old. And then they get kind of expedited out there. But until then, it's almost like a battle royal of them fighting each other over and over.
Yeah, and I mean, being in a position where you're kind of just having to fight through all of these really great fighters too turns you into a really good fighter,
Yeah.
and eventually moving up to, when I don't know if it was just an issue of being clear that he was never going to get a shot at middleweight, or he just couldn't really make middleweight anymore, decided to move up to light heavyweight. Either way, he at least had the stature and obviously the punch to be able to take a stab at light heavyweight. But the thing was, dude, the guy, his career was so long and it went through like so many different kind of stages that I almost get it, like the timeline messed up, because it's weird to think that like it took so long for him to get a shot at the light heavyweight championship, and then he gets a shot at Rocky Marciano, but then he goes back, because it's like he takes a whooping against Rocky Marciano. I mean, understandably so, but he takes a whooping, but then just goes back and is still whooping ass at light heavyweight. Like it just
And it,
that's so weird to me.
and I have to go back and like mention this, man. Like, even though Mora was considered maybe the uncrowned light heavyweight champion, he wasn't the best in that division because Ezra Charles was still there. And Ezra
Yep.
Charles conveniently made sure that Mora realized that Ezra was his daddy all the time.
He absolutely spanked the shit out of him, unfortunately. I mean, no shame, because Ezra Charles might be the greatest light heavyweight of all time despite never actually holding the championship. Just looking at the run that he went on at light heavyweight, it's kind of absurd, but part of that run was just picking Archie Moore up and chucking him down a small hill. He
Yes.
was just like, sorry, buddy, not tonight.
There's like still photos of Moore just looking like on his knees, and while Charles is just ripping at him, you see Moore. It's bad. It's really really bad. Charles was a different type of animal. So by the time he finally moved up, that's when Moore was like, okay, I think I have a clear
Now I
path.
could get something done.
I can get something done because like the fucking boogeyman's away from me now.
Poor guy. Yeah,
It
the
really,
whole
really
timeline is weird to me.
absolutely. But by the time he finally gets a shot against Joey Maxim, who became champion, after, like, think about the guys that were avoiding Archie Moore up at that point, right? You had Gus Lesnovich. Gus Lesnovich was not a bad champion, a tough fighter, but clearly levels below probably a guy like Moore. And if Moore had a chance against me, definitely would have whooped him. Freddie Miller. Freddie Miller is not Miller. Freddie Mills. Excuse me. Same thing. Tough as nails guy that probably would have put up a good fight against Moore, but definitely would have got bludgeoned. And then Joey Maxim. And Joey Maxim was finally the one that was able to get that gave Moore a title fight. But I think it was the reason why Moore finally got it late in his career the way he did is because he had to sign with Jack Kearns, wasn't it? Because Kearns was already Maxim's manager.
Yeah, there was something he had to do. Was it Kearns?
I
He had to
don't,
sign something to kind of like sell out a little bit to get the shot
yeah, for sure. Because he
after
definitely
however
wasn't
many
getting that on
years.
his merit.
That's fucking wild, dude.
Absolutely, definitely wasn't getting it on his merits. So I feel like it was something to do with Kearns that Kearns, made some. Because obviously, a guy like Jack Kearns, the little scoundrel that everyone tries to make it out to be, the lovely guy that, oh, yeah, he's just a lovable scoundrel that people remember. No, it wasn't. He was a piece of shit.
Yeah, he's pretty
And
dirty.
very, very dirty. That's being nice about it. But he definitely did what he had to do, I'm sure, to make a deal that he was getting some kind of incentive if Moore was going to get a shot.
Fool basically got chased out of court by Jack Dempsey. Like I think it was twice, and still wound up peddling the story about the hand wraps and shit. Like, yeah, he wasn't a good dude. He wasn't a very good dude.
But
Well, and
being said, he was able finally in 1952 to become champion.
Well, shit. I mean, 1952, and what did he start in 1935 to 1952. So damn near almost 20 years to become world champion, dude. That's a long ass time. I think it's what's his name? Chalky Wright was like 13 years and change, which in and of itself is pretty wild. But like, yeah, goddamn 17 years. Jesus.
I
That's
mean,
nuts.
and that's like a long, like that's like two careers that he had at that point, considering the competition that he fought, everyone he had to go through over and over. And Maxim was no slouch. Give him credit for that. Like, Maxim kind of gets like forgotten over the years, or if not forgotten, he's kind of like looked upon like, a little bit more downward. Because, oh, he's the guy that outlasted Sugar Ray Robinson because Robinson got too tired.
Hmm.
Or here's this, or here's that.
Hmm.
No. Maxim, right? Maxim was a badass, man. You got to give him his just due. All
He
right.
fought in that heat too, man.
He absolutely did. But he was an iron chin dude. The only time he was ever stopped, I believe, was against Curtis Shepard, Hatchman Shepard. And other than that, sure, he was dropped many times, as did Charles bouncing like a basketball whenever he moved up to heavyweight to fight him. Moore definitely dropped him a few times. Other fighters rocked him around. But he was a classic boxer with an iron chin, and was one of the toughest guys of his era, and definitely deserved to be in the Hall of Fame. So give him credit where credit is due. If it wasn't Archie Moore, Maxim probably would have beat a guy of the same age rather comprehensively. So
Yeah, for sure. A guy who gets overlooked, and it's kind of unfortunate because he was definitely a very good fighter and a very good light heavyweight too, but just was not. It was Archie Moore. Archie Moore, like we've talked about him on other shows, but
Archie was mad at that point too, bro. You know what I mean? He was
uh,
bitter. It took so long for him to become champion. All right, enough is enough.
and he had the power, he had the skills. We've talked about his skills on numerous occasions because he was a highly skilled guy. It wasn't just 130 knockouts, but he
Yeah.
wasn't the kind of puncher where he was just like sleeping everybody. He was tricking them into the knockout. He was walking you into the knockout. That's the problem, is that he was a very, very tricky fighter, and he was a guy that was really, really difficult to deal with. And he remained fairly difficult to deal with for the most part. It was just that, later on in his career, the guys that he were fighting was just better. And also the opportunities that he got were just, I think, came at the wrong time. And again, toward the end of his career, dude, like he had been fighting a long ass time.
Dude, he was already at that. Like you said, he had the scars on his stomach. He was graying at the sides. He was old, like he was an older fighter at that point. And so when he's defending now in the mid 50s as champion against Harold Johnson, long time, he already traded wins and losses back and forth with a guy like that. That was the one time you said Moore was always relaxing the ring and kind of, putting people to traps. That was the one title fight where he had to like actually jump out and do something wild because he was losing. And Johnson, who had been with him and knew how to box him and knew what he was doing with a guy like
And was
Moore.
a very good fighter.
Oh my God, and a very good boxer too. And if Moore was going to try to be boring with you, Johnson knew how to bring it even more boring. Like he wasn't a Mr. Excitement, you know what I mean? And Moore was struggling. He's behind on points, and then finally around like round 14, was it around 14? It was round 14. He jumps in like with like a surprise attack that Johnson was not expecting, and kind of took him out. But that's the type of shit he had to do. When he fought Bobo Olsen and defended his belt against him. Poor Bobo, feeling himself a little bit. I think he beat Maxim and before this fight, and like, was dominant middleweight champion. It was feeling himself. Like, okay. To the point where I think the Molson was actually considering to challenge Marciano for the title had he beat Archie Moore. Yeah, I see you
Bobo,
head right
no.
now. Yeah, yeah.
Bobo, don't do it.
I mean,
It'll
it's
knock the bald right off your head, bro.
well, that's what Archie Moore did. Because Moore, Bobo didn't do bad for the first round and a half until Moore started gauging his distance and getting a beat on him, and once he did,
Dude, I got nothing against Bobo Olsen. He's probably a super nice dude. I've heard good stories about him,
he
but
was,
at
yeah.
like damn near every big fight he had, almost every big fight he had, it would be like he'd be doing good, then just get hit and be like, ugh, ugh.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like every big fight, dude. Poor guy.
There's a lot of, I hate to say it, but there are a lot of photos of him just laid out, just unconscious after, whether it be Robinson, whether it be Archie Moore, whether it be, I think Jose Torres did the trick against him. Um, Pat McMurdy, who we talked about on a past show, knocked him out late in his yeah,
Or Bobo.
you know what? It's lucky for him that Archie Moore, weighing 175, or probably a lot lighter for that matter, knocking him out than someone like Marciano just clubbing him in the head.
That's probably true. Yeah. Oh man.
Because that just, oh my God, I can't even imagine what caveman clubbing Marciano would have done to him.
And that's another thing that messes me up about the timeline is how late in his career the Darrell fight came.
Yes, yeah.
Like,
Because they
because to
came
me, I'm
out
like, oh, that's like
funny.
50s. That's early in his career. Nah, dude, that's like toward the end.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. It came what? Did it come? It came after Marciano, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The first one was 1958. Next one was 1959. I mean, he had already gotten his ass whooped by Marciano. Poor guy. Good gravy, dude.
Yeah, yeah, you see it right now, man. That first fight too is one of the all-time great fights. Moore gets dropped like 3 times in the first. He gets up, he gets dropped again. Like he's beat around that fight. And if this didn't happen in the late 50s, say it happened in 2098, 2008, let alone today's age, fight definitely would have been stopped immediately.
Yep. Get
Not
the
a
old British stoppage.
Oh yeah, 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 for sure. Especially at a guy like Moore's age, just getting dropped over and over like that. No one would let that go on because they're gonna think it's like elder abuse.
Yeah,
And
dude.
Moore came on, scoring one of the great, comeback knockouts in history. That was a fight that was actually featured on Classic Sports. In between, um, listing Eddie Machin, not Ali, Marciano, Joe Lewis, and I don't know
Mike
whatever.
Tyson Jaco or some shit.
Yeah, yeah, some shit like that. Yeah,
Some
like that.
fucking random shit. Some random ass shit. Mike Tyson, Mike Jameson or something like that. Some
But once
weird.
in a while, they would show, more
That's
Darrell.
true. Yeah, that's true. Fighting fishermen. That's crazy just how late in his career. By the time, he's winding down Willie Pastrano, the fact that he even gets a draw at Willie Pastrano, but works his way to a Muhammad Ali, a shot at Muhammad Ali pre-heavyweight championship because of the whole angle of where Archie Moore was his trainer, but then Muhammad Ali's now mad at him because he doubted him and or there's some host of reasons. So Muhammad Ali's vowing to get more and four, and that's what he does.
And if you want, I remember seeing that clip of that fight, and I was like, "Who is this old man in the ring?" Because he looks so ponderous, and he just looked really old. And Ali was like slapping him around. If you see more, he's just kind of like shuffling and falling to the ring. Like he just looks like he's bewildered and old and shouldn't be around. He should be in an old folks home or something.
Yeah,
And I was,
Ali's not even like fully taking it. Like he's not like
he's
really like
literally like
he's
doing
just
like
kind of like
a foreign partner. He's just kind of like not even
yeah.
trying. I'm just like, what is this? Was this a guy that just got mad at Ali and was like, "I'm going to teach you a lesson as an old man," and just got slapped down for it? Because that's
He
how.
was probably like secretly getting him a payday and just acting like he was mad at him.
And so, as a young kid, because that was my first exposure to more, was this Ali video. So I'm like, I had no idea just seeing this old man. But then when I actually read about him and saw his career and saw other clips of him, I was just like, my God, I became fascinated again. Like Moore was incredible. So he ends his career against Mike DiBiase, and Snapple fact, that's the $1 million man, Ted DiBiase's dad.
Hell yeah, we're bringing up wrestling trivia today.
Yeah, we are a few. I mean, when it needs to be put in there, it absolutely should be, and this
Hell
is
yeah.
definitely one. And it kind of brings back the fact that wrestlers would randomly take fights that you just wouldn't suspect. Freddie Blassie against two-ton Tony Galento, Mike DiBiase against Archie Moore. I know you have other examples, but yeah, that was how
Even
Moore.
Frank Gotch, dude.
My gosh, absolutely. And so what's crazy though is that like, okay, Moore retires finally in 1963. And but he's not done with boxing. Like he's still kind of active in the sport, still, watching, observing, training some people until he latches on with a young phenom, aka freak, aka, a person that no one had seen.
Scary bastard.
Scariest man on the planet, the likes that the world had not seen since the days of fucking Jack Dempsey, let alone Joe Lewis. Not excuse me, let alone Sonny Liston. That's George Foreman. And again, like imagine the combo you have. Forget Dick Sadler. Like, yeah, he was Foreman's main trainer, but think about the combo you have here. Archie Moore, 131 knockouts, one of the baddest men that ever walked the planet. Sandy Sadler. All right, a dude who was so just into violence and loving and the smiles that he would get on his face, the way he would put violence on his opponents. That the fact that you would think he might be kind of um sociopath to a degree. Those were his trainers.
Might
Like
headbutt you, might knock you out, might knee you, might
didn't
forearm
care,
you,
find a way to
whatever.
win, and find it justifiable for what he did to you.
Dude, you know what's crazy too,
Those
though?
were his two trainers.
You know what's crazy too, though, is speaking of which, I was watching, it's somewhat related,
Yeah,
the knockout, George Foreman's knockout of Jose Roman.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
That shit was dirty as fuck, bro. Dude, he hit him up
Absolutely.
really hard when he was down. Like, and referee was like not even close to, like, he was not even thinking about doing shit, dude. That guy got blasted. I mean, like I said, only semi-related, but Archie Moore, yeah, did work with George Foreman, but also worked in gyms and worked with kids pretty much like his entire life, his entire adult life. He was working with kids and also became a movie star.
He did. He did. Oh yeah, he was in a few films. Like he was a big jazz fan. So you see photos of him with like guys like Lucky Thompson and other people. And he was
He
in Huck Finn.
played French horn.
He did, yeah. And he was in Huck Finn, like you said,
Yep.
playing it. So fast forward now, Foreman retires, and more like you said, he's still working more with the youth and kind of doing things. But in terms of being on TV and being a presence now, he's taking a step back for a while. Foreman comes back in the late '80s, in the mid '80s now, 1987. Archie Moore comes back with him, and more, as Foreman's comeback starts, building momentum, and he's being featured more on TV and yada yada yada, blah blah. Blah. So is Moore now. Archie Moore is doing more interviews. Archie Moore, is being featured now in, little mini docs and stuff like that. And it's so cool to see because like Archie Moore had that longest career, all right, that lasted as long as it did up until 1963 from the late 30s. And now he's got George Foreman who's coming back and now having this late career resurgence. And it's like, what are you telling this man to have him to have the same longevity that you did? You know what I mean? And you see Moore there, and he's so fascinating looking, right? He had that cap on with all the pins. He's gray, but he can still in shape. He can still tell he has all his wits about him. And um, like one moment in like 1990, for instance, when Foreman's comeback really started to take wind. All right, he knocks out Jerry Cooney, and then he's featured on HBO for the first time against Adelson Rodriguez. And as bullshit as that card was, because Tyson knocked out Henry Tillman in one round and Foreman blasted out Rodriguez. I'm always going to be a sucker for outdoor shows, outdoor HBO, like outdoor boxing matches in Vegas, especially when the sun is still setting a little bit. And the sun was still setting when Foreman knocked the shit out of Rodriguez.
Yeah, they need to bring Caesars back, bro. The
Yeah,
parking
yeah,
lot.
yeah. Parking lots. Yeah, there was something just cool about that whole series. And they zoom in before the fight on Archie Moore, who's just leaning in, leaning on the ropes, just kind of taking in the scenes, and God knows what's going through his brain, right? And Larry Merchant is like, there's a great light heavyweight champion, Archie Moore, one of the greatest fighters of all time. And he was like, something, when I was the editor of whatever newspaper he was in LA, that Merchant that he was doing, he said, Archie Moore used to send me all the time 5 to 10 page letters, written letters to him, talking about different things he wanted to discuss about, which I thought was pretty fucking cool that he said. And there was other accounts too from other writers, guys like Jeff Ryan, who you might remember from
Yep.
From the Old Ring magazine articles, and other writers who said that they would interview Moore during that time period, and Moore would be talking, yada yada yada, doing whatever, and then at random parts he would just jump out of his seat and flurry for about 15 to 20 seconds, just do a complete flurry, and just shadow box, and then just sit back down again, catch his breath, start talking again, jump up and start doing that. And then he would say, I can do that for about a round and a half. Like, or something like, or how many rounds he said he could do it for.
I'm not trying to be one of those people who winds up in the paper like person knocked out by former champ. No, I'm not. No, I know too well now. I've seen too many just absolute nerdy looking dudes just stand, walk right up to him, wouldn't even think twice about saying shit. They'd knock you clean out, dude. Same thing. I know too well now. I'm not messing with no old Archie Moores. No way. Fuck that.
and that's the crazy thing is that like Moore would and if you watch, there's a clip on YouTube where they're introducing the initial class of the Boxing Hall of Fame, and it's at like Canastota High School or something. They're all in the box. They're all in the ring. Um, you have Napoles. You have Ike Williams, Patterson, Bob Foster. You know, the list goes on and on, like of legends that were Emil Griffith. You know, all the guys, right, that were in the ring that day for that. And Archie gets introduced, and when he comes in the ring, he waves and then he jumps and actually gets in his whole like crab defense stance that he did back in the day. Moves around a little bit, jabs, goes over, throws a hook, ducks like that. The crowd goes absolutely wild. And he looks smooth doing it. It wasn't like an old guy trying to go through the motions. Like he looked like he was, you know, kind of like, remember we were just talking about Duran earlier in the show, moving around with Sergio Moro, just kind of moving. That's how Archie Moore looked, except he was even older. Like
Crazy.
Moore
I
still
believe
did
it.
it. He completely pivoted beautifully off his foot, his back foot, spun around, did some angles like that, threw a couple of jabs. I'm like, yo, guy was ageless. And I'm so, you know, I'm so disappointed. I don't want to say disappointed is not the right word because it was just circumstance. I feel bad that I never had a chance to meet him because we really, I think Moore passed away in the late 90s or so, like very, you know,
Yeah.
90-ish or whatever around what is around there. And the first year I went to
I
the
didn't look, but I
holiday,
want to say 98.
probably you're right, 98, 99, around that time,
98.
98. And my first year at the Hall of Fame was 2000. Oh, Mora was very active going there every single year up until around his death, I believe. So it's like, you know, it came him, Willie Pep, and Eddie Fletcher, the three that I just came this close that I just missed out on. I got to meet a lot of incredible fighters that I'm blessed to have met over the years. A lot of them that have since passed away. Got a chance to interact with them, photos, everything you can imagine. But those are the guys I just missed. I'm just like, you know,
Damn. Well, I mean, Archie Moore, dude, it's a long life, a long career. He shook a lot of hands along the way, knocked out a lot of mouthy mofos along the way, too. You know what I'm saying?
and he did.
No, we've talked about a number of really good fighters on this show already. I think we are probably going to have to do a part two. Part two is probably going to have to be a little bit more of a deep dive, a little bit more of a, there's going to be maybe a few names that are not quite as famous, but hey, we mentioned some real famous names today, some real good names
Sure, absolutely. Look
for sure,
forward to
man.
part two. Yeah,
Yeah, I think part two is probably going to have to be necessary. But in the meanwhile, dude, I appreciate you, dude. Thanks so much for coming on, talking some history with me. It's always a really fun time, dude.
absolutely, man. It's been a blast as always.
Everybody who listened in, thanks so much. And if you listened in on one of the podcast apps, please continue to do so. Subscribe and leave a comment. And if you watched on YouTube, thanks so much for that too. Subscribe, leave a comment, and we'll try to reply. As far as social media goes, the Knuckles and Gloves podcast is on both Facebook and Instagram. It's on Twitter for the time being as well, but also we are on Twitter. My buddy Aris is on there as Punch Zone Aris. I'm there as Patrick M. Connor. Say hello. We'll try to say hello back. And Aris, we'll talk soon, bro.
Have a good one, y'all.
Everybody.